putting this paper on the agenda. It's been a terrific conference. Also, I'm very lucky to have three terrific co-authors. Asil is joining Duke University, their law faculty, in the fall. Paulo is a truly extraordinary graduate student here at the University of Chicago. And Amanda. Everyone knows Amanda, so, okay. Not that she's not extraordinary, it's just, okay. Also, I think I lost the... Just give it a sec. Hold on, he's got to run up there. Oh, okay.
You can sing if you'd like.
Maybe I'll do that. Yeah. There we go. So traditionally, industrial organization economists have treated mergers as one-off transactions that are devised and backed by operating companies. Increasingly, however, markets are being shaped by roll-ups, which are series of related transactions that are formulated and financed by investment funds. They're relevant to the people in this room for several reasons. For example, roll-ups by definition are transactions in a given market. So firms in turn business stealing externalities, and they could threaten the competitive process. Individual transactions are often comparatively small, so they'll be exempt from pre-merger notification. As a result, typically avoid antitrust scrutiny, at least in their incipiency. Financial sponsors oftentimes will be directly involved in the day-to-day affairs of these businesses, and that could negatively impact outcomes. And if none of that resonates, you should also be aware of the fact that they have grown to exceed today about $1 trillion in domestic deal volume. They are probably more than half of horizontal M&A. So if you're interested in how markets are organized, industries are organized, then you might want to pay attention to these transactions. So given the terrific size, the potential harm, the likely underenforcement, in this paper we'll ask how roll-ups affect market structure and other outcomes. We'll do so in the context of the U.S. anesthesia industry, which is home to very recently the first roll-up-based antitrust case in U.S. history. We'll use the complaint, at least at first, to motivate and inform our analysis. I say it first because court documents really only address a single firm in a single state and redact all the relevant market outcomes, and so we'll need comprehensive, not just ownership, but also claims data. We'll identify and document roll-ups nationwide over about a 10-year period, measure changes in outcomes like prices, estimate a structural model of bargaining, and then use the parameters that we recover to simulate counterfactual outcomes, given, say, remedies that courts, judges are currently contemplating, and also that the legislature is currently considering. Okay, so very briefly, the roll-up was formulated as a sort of niche investment strategy in the mid-1980s by Carl Thoma and his partners, here in Chicago, in fact. But since then, it has grown rapidly. It comprises, for example, or accounts for about 80% of all private equity transactions, which themselves are about half of domestic deal volume. By most counts, it's more than half, as I said, of U.S. horizontal M&A. Roll-ups are easy to characterize. There's a financial sponsor, which is often, but not always, a private equity firm that funds and directs a series of investments. So in particular, the financial sponsor makes an initial acquisition in the market, the target of which is commonly called the platform, and then it injects capital into the platform to acquire other businesses in the market. Naturally, it's typically easier to merge many small firms into one large one than the other way around, so the platforms are oftentimes much bigger than the add-ons. Study this in the U.S. anesthesia industry, where highly trained medical professionals that we call clinicians anesthetize patients during surgery. Nearly all of these are full-time employees of single specialty groups that we call practices. Multiple practices may be owned by a single entity. When this occurs, the practices usually retain a lot of their identity, and we certainly hope their clinical autonomy. But business decisions are often made at a higher level that we'll call the firm. So a firm will own one or more practices, which each of those are going to comprise multiple clinicians. Markets here correspond to MSAs. Entry is costly and as a result, rare. And anesthesia is billed separately from the non-anesthesia components of your surgery, which will become or be convenient later on. Okay, to see how yes. Oh, pricing, for example, as opposed to how much of a particular opiate to give the patient while they're under. Good. So to see how roll-ups intersect the anesthesia industry, I want to turn attention to 3 textbook cases. All of these trace back to early 2012, when a healthcare executive named JR pitched an investment idea to a large financial sponsor known as Welsh, Carson, Anderson, and Stowe. According to internal Welsh Carson communications, the goal was to build a platform by consolidating practices with high share in a few key markets and gain negotiating leverage over commercial payers. A few months later, Welsh Carson Partners opted to invest, and they formed a holding company called U.S. Anesthesia Partners, or USAP for short. A few months after that, USAP devised its plan to roll up Houston. As many of you have heard, they internally called this plan very cleverly, Roll Up Houston. At the end of 2012, they acquired their first practice, Greater Houston Anesthesiology, and over the next 7 years, added on 3 more. Between 2013 and 2018, separately, they rolled up the markets or completed roll-ups in Dallas and Austin for a total of 9 acquisitions there. The transactions were apparently lucrative. Lead partner at Welsh Carson, the head of their healthcare group, remarked after one of them, ka-ching. We know this because on September 21st, 2023, the Federal Trade Commission charged USAP and Welsh Carson, alleging that the defendants consolidated and monopolized markets in violation of Section 7, 2, and other antitrust statutes. It's the first case challenging a series of completed transactions under U.S. merger law. Also, I think interesting, the FTC was not notified of these transactions in their incipiency. As evidence, I'd point to the fact that former agency chair, Lena Khan, borrowed language from my earlier work, the 2019 paper in particular, when she called the sequence of mergers a, quote, stealth consolidation scheme. So we'll collect data from various sources. Ultimately, we'll observe at the procedure level, the price, the clinician, the practice, the firm, the date when the procedure occurred, the hospital where it occurred, and by extension, the market, as well as some other stuff. We have a 10-year period here. Until I say otherwise, and I will at the end of the talk, I'll restrict attention to rolled up markets. That is ones where the financial sponsor makes a platform acquisition and then completes at least one add-on. This goes far beyond Texas. We have 18 markets spread out across the United States. They cover nearly a quarter of the US population. This also goes far beyond Welsh Carson and USAP. We have 9 unique sponsors and a total of 50 add-on acquisitions. So the first question we'll have, quite naturally, is whether roll-ups are an important determinant in a market structure. To answer this, within each market, we'll compare 2 time series. One will track actual changes in HHI relative to some base period. The other measures predicted changes in HHI. That is, we'll exploit the fact that holding all else equal, an acquisition of one firm by another raises HHI by 2 times the share of the target times the share of the acquirer, with those shares evaluated just prior to each transaction. We can sum those up over time And that will depict how the market would have evolved solely as a result of the add-ons, that is, absent other changes like endogenous entry or exit or market share expansion or contraction. Let's start here with the litigated markets. The panels here correspond to Houston, Dallas, and Austin. On the x-axis, we'll plot calendar time. On the y-axis, HHI changes relative to a base period here, arbitrarily chosen to be 2013. So the y-axis values are all set equal to 0 at that point. The blue line depicts actual HHI changes since that year. The red line, these predicted HHI changes. That is how the market would have evolved solely as a result of the roll-ups. You can see here most clearly, I think, in the left two panels, these large markets of Houston and Dallas, each of which comprise about 8 million people or so. First, with respect to the solid blue line, we have HHI changes that are on the order of about 1,000 points or more. For context, the merger guidelines indicate that a transaction is presumptively anti-competitive, that is illegal under the substantive standard, Section 7. If those changes are 100 points or more, this is an order of magnitude larger. Also, you can see from the close correspondence between the solid blue and the dashed red line that roll-ups are the primary determinant of market structure changes in these areas of the country. What we can do now is look for observationally similar roll-ups around the country. This will be exceedingly hard to see, especially in the back, so I'll just summarize it. We have 15 other markets here. Even in large markets like Las Vegas or Phoenix or Denver, we have cumulative HHI changes, which are on the order of 1,000, sometimes 2,000 or 3,000 points. Also, and I think you can probably see this all the way in the back, that there's a close correspondence between the dashed red and the solid blue line, once again indicating that roll-ups are the primary determinant of increases in concentration over the sample period. They're really what you want to pay attention to, at least in this industry. Okay, much more importantly, how do prices evolve? To answer this, we'll let each acquisition be an event. We'll index event time by tau and the target firms by R. We'll define Y sub R tau equal to the log price charged by the target at a particular point in event time. I'll restrict attention here to 16 quarters, 4 years on each side of every transaction and estimate a staggered event study research design. Here with two-way fixed effects, that is fixed effects at the acquisition or the target level and the quarter level. You can employ more sophisticated techniques. You'll see in the slide. It won't matter. I'll start out by talking about the platform acquisitions. Recall, this is the sponsor's first time in the market. So by definition, that first acquisition, that doesn't increase concentration, probably doesn't impact competition, and you might not expect that it's going to affect price. And that's precisely what we see. I think, to my eye, an absence of any meaningful pre-event trend and outcomes trending smoothly or evolving smoothly through these events. There's a little bit of daylight on the right-hand side of the graph between the plotted points and the x-axis, but I'll come back to that in a moment. These are also useful because seeing this pattern in particular is useful. It tends to rule out what I'm going to call the Martin-Shkreli type business strategy, which might exist. You might worry, based on what you're about to see, that private equity firms have this strategy of finding practices whose prices are too low, going in, getting a controlling stake in those businesses, and then raising the prices abruptly. But if that were true, we would see it here. That doesn't tend to be the case. What I'll now do is replicate this figure, but for add-on acquisitions. Recall, this is the second and the third and so on acquisition in the market by the financial sponsor. It increases concentration, it may impact competition, and we might see higher prices. That's precisely what we see here. We see price increases that are on the order of about 30 to 40% within about a year or two of these transactions. If you are worried about healthcare expenditures in the United States, you might want to pay attention to these sorts of deals. I'll come back to the fact that on the right-hand side of the graph, it appears as if there's some daylight for the platform acquisitions between the plotted points and the x-axis. What's happening here is that when you get 2 or 3 years out, the platform is being followed by an add-on acquisition or 2. And so if the firm is internalizing business stealing externalities, they're not just going to increase prices at the add-on, but also, obviously, they're going to be increasing them for the platform. Those price increases are much more pronounced if for no other reason the platforms are typically much larger than the add-ons are. You might wonder whether there's like a one monopoly price floating around here. That is to say, more simply put, that the price of the non-anesthesia components of your surgery are falling as the anesthesia prices are going up. That doesn't seem to be the case. I'll take the previous figure here, but on the left-hand side, replace anesthesia prices with prices for the non-anesthesia components of anesthetized procedures. No meaningful impact. Defendants have claimed that quality improves after these acquisitions, that the sponsor perhaps is spreading best practices, if you will. But we obtained or measured, employed a number of sort of best practice measures that come from the medical literature assessing quality in anesthesia. And you can see here, if anything, maybe quality declines in certain cases, but no obvious impact. The scale of the y-axes show that these are just unimportant.
It's being interpreted as like a labor union for doctors.
Maybe, but with very different laws. So no, and most of the money here, for what it's worth, as the transactions play out, and these are eventually sold, the private equity company will either take it public or what have you. Most of the money is not going to the doctors here. So no, in that sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know what the payments are when they make a purchase?
Sometimes, but not always. They're typically. Yeah, sure. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We should measure that. You're right. That'd be interesting. But by and large, the dollars go to Wall Street, Stamford, Connecticut, usually. Yeah. Okay. Finally, in some recent work by Volker and Mike Winston, they'll show that, and this would be under conditions that are a little bit more restrictive than ours, but that post-acquisition price changes are monotonically increasing in the predicted HHI changes. So we can look within the add-on acquisitions rather than just doing comparisons between them and other types of transactions and assess how, on the x-axis, log-predicted HHI changes relate to log-predicted post-acquisition price changes or realized price changes. And I think it's pretty clear there's a monotone positive relationship here. So that would square with what you would expect. To conduct counterfactuals, we'll have to, Steve looks very concerned there. No, I didn't know if that was a question. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. So to conduct the counterfactuals, we'll have to estimate structural, put some structure on the problem. Well, privately insured patients will require surgeries. Those surgeries will be performed as at calligraphic H of hospitals. In most areas of medicine, the patient chooses the provider. But in this industry, typically the hospital chooses. The anesthesia will be provided by a set Cal A of practices, or the hospital can opt for a sort of outside option. This is the hospital more or less arranging the anesthesia themselves, but with heavy or almost complete reliance on a staffing agency, a sort of temp agency for doctors and nurses. In industry, they call that locum tenens. It is Latin for to take the place of. The practices are owned by a set calligraphic F of firms. The reimbursements are paid by a set calligraphic J of insurers, or maybe more precisely, managed care organizations. We employ standard timing assumptions. So to start, firms and the insurers will simultaneously Nash bargain. If they reach an agreement, it'll be an in-network price, P sub FJ. If not, an out-of-network price, P bar. Once the bargaining is complete, the hospital observes the network and chooses a provider. I'll go into a little bit more detail in the next few slides, but just for expositional ease, I'm going to work backwards here from demand. So the hospitals will issue requests for proposals, or RFPs, to exclusively staff their facilities. As I alluded to earlier, the hospital, because it's choosing the provider, may wind up in a situation where some of the patients are out of network with respect to their insurance plan. So to tackle these situations, we'll follow recent work in the JPE by Fiona and co-authors. And in particular, we'll assume that if the practice is in network, then the insurer pays the entire bill. But if not, it only pays a fraction of the bill. The balance is sent to the patient, who is typically surprised and oftentimes very frustrated to receive a charge for several $1,000s that they were not expecting. To capture this, we'll have this hospital suffer a loss in utility, which is measured by negative theta. This represents many things. For example, reputational damage, could be a contractual penalty. You should look to the Fiona's paper for, I think, a more elegant explanation or comprehensive explanation as to what that means. But it is worth pointing out that, consistent with the claims in that paper, nearly all publicly accessible RFPs that we've ever been able to get our hands on emphasize the importance of the payer relationships. That is, the hospital would really like to choose a provider, a practice that's in network with the bulk of its patients. Hospital choices will maximize their payoffs. Those payoffs are, on a per patient basis, additively separable in practice characteristics, X, the in-network dummy, N, and an additively separable error, epsilon. And then from the standpoint of the hospital, they're getting sent many patients from several insurance plans. And as a result of that, they're going to have to take a weighted average or just sum up weight by the patient flows. If the hospital selects the outside option, they receive payoffs which are normalized here, whose mean is normalized to 0. We'll assume epsilon's distributed type 1 extreme values, so we get the very convenient logit individual choice probabilities. I'll describe bargaining on the next slide, but let me just say here, when the bargaining is going to occur, F and J are not going to know the draws that the hospitals realize, so they're going to have to integrate out over the distribution of the epsilons, obviously. Okay, take a step back now. So the insurers and the firms seek to maximize their profit. Both of these profit expressions are self-evident, but maybe just to go through the insurers. So on a per patient basis, they'll receive profits, which will come from enrollees where the hospital is in network and is out of network, and where the hospital is choosing locum tenens. And then they too will weight by these patient flows. Firms have an analogous equation here, but it's flipped. The tension here is that the insurer wants a low price, relatively speaking, whereas the firm wants a high price for the services. We'll assume simultaneous Nash bargaining. Each pair, FJ, will agree to an in-network price, which is given by the following. It simply maximizes the product of the parties' respective gains from trade. And that's so long as there is some price at which both parties can receive positive gains from trade. For those that are not familiar with bargaining, it complicates the logic a little bit, and certainly having the hospital be the one who's choosing, but not here, the payer, the residual claimant on what the price is, makes the notation a little bit more difficult. But I just want you to realize in this problem that the ordinary recapture logic goes through. So just to fix ideas, if you think about the problem from the standpoint of a target that's about to be acquired, and this is prior to the acquisition, conceptually, they want to push hard on price, push price up, but at some point, the insurer might kick them out, so to speak. And if that happens, that makes them less attractive to hospitals in the area, and so an expectation the quantity is going to fall. So you've got the ordinary price quantity trade-off here. Now think about that problem, analogous problem, after the acquisition is complete. Again, from the standpoint of that target practice. Again, pushes hard on price, might get kicked out of a network, but it realizes now that we're certain hospitals to choose away from it, substitute towards other practices. Those practices, some of them, will now be jointly owned by the same firm or same parent, if you will. So the ordinary recapture logic or the internalization of business dealing externalities works, whether you're thinking about bargaining or not, for the most part. We'll minimize a GMM objective function. In the interest of time, I will move forward to the counterfactuals. Most natural counterfactual to consider, of course, is unwinding. The court could order the divestiture of the completed add-ons. In many industries, I would concede that unscrambling the eggs is probably impossible. Firms oftentimes commingle their assets. They share competitively sensitive information. There may be long-term projects that are aborted upon acquisition. For the most part, that's not true here. I think it would be comparatively easy to order these divestitures and have the firms stood up. For example, in Houston, this would be USAP, divesting of North Houston, and Metro West and Guardian. That would restore competition. In this case, we would forecast annual expenditure changes on the order over the 18 markets of about $100 million a year. Those savings almost certainly will persist for many years. For example, if they persist for about 7 years, and we have a discount rate of about 10%, then the total savings in present value terms is going to be on the order of about $500 million. That is not, however, the end of the story. This is a novel court case, and so I would expect it will impact agents' beliefs about how likely it is that future roll-ups will be profitable. So in layperson's terms, you could imagine that if the court hands down an expensive judgment, say in the private litigation, where the damages are trebled or tripled, and the statute of limitations is 4 years, so there's many years worth of damages accruing, this could be very expensive to the financial sponsor. As a result of that, if I'm a sponsor, I'm looking at doing future acquisitions, roll-ups, I am probably disincentivized from completing many of them. You could accomplish the same with changes to the pre-merger notification program, whether it be through the law or the rules. That is to say, if the government had a look at these transactions in their incipiency and committed to litigate them, were they to be attempted, my guess would be they would never be attempted in the first place. So for a back-of-the-envelope calibration of the value of deterrence here, we're going to look at 67 markets where the sponsor has acquired a platform, but not yet completed any add-on acquisitions. These are relatively recent. So we would think of these as being cases where they'll eventually turn into a roll-up, but the sponsor just hasn't had time to complete the add-ons. What we'll do is simulate a roll-up in each of these markets. In particular, we'll take one firm, make that firm the target. We'll select that firm by choosing one whose market share is as close as possible to the targets in the main sample of 18. Then we'll assume that those add-ons would be completed, but for an adverse judgment against the defendant, say in the USAP case, or a change in the pre-merger notification rules or law or what have you. And in this case, we forecast annual changes of expenditures, which are on the order of about $40 million or so. It is not clear whether this is a dramatic under or overestimate of the total value of deterrence. It could naturally be a overestimate. Perhaps, for example, add-ons may not be completed anyway in all 67 of these markets that we see. However, it might also be a substantial underestimate. In particular, these roll-ups are happening in other medical specialties. So in a follow-up paper, probably intended for a law audience, we are looking at some other industries where there are roll-ups, just observationally similar transactions. And you can see here whether it be in gastro or radiology or urology, we have similar large changes in HHI, which closely correspond with the predicted changes. Moreover, if you look especially at the period from, this is not on the graph, from 2021 onwards, there has been huge amounts of money pouring into medical services, in particular acquisitions of what look a lot like sponsors in or platforms in areas like oncology, neonatal, and other specialties. Many of those, without a change in the rules or the laws or an adverse judgment, could quite naturally become roll-ups themselves. Yeah.
Way more a single acquisition that is way more than 100 points.
That's true. Some of these are, I mean, here we were just finding a select set. We sort of sorted. And yeah, I should say, here we just looked over these three specialties in particular, sorted and found the worst. So. Oh, the FTC was never notified of any of these. So you might think that some of these will one day turn into federal antitrust litigation, but at this point, that is off everyone's radar, except for ours and the people here. Yeah. Finally, I'll just say a few words about potential entry. As an equilibrating force, high profits naturally can attract rivals that undercut existing prices. Entry into anesthesia, as I alluded to earlier, is rare because it's costly. Ultimately, it's hard. Clinicians are scarce, and note, they'd have to move as a group. It's not enough to have just one or two move. You'd have to have a group come into the market. So were it to occur, our view would be most likely arises from adjacent markets. And as a result of that, platforms could have incentives to pay one or two very specific practices to stay away.
Couldn't some existing anesthesiologists just spin off their own firm and entry occur that way?
Oh, certainly. But again, they'd all have to move basically as a group. So the hospital is going to want an exclusive contract with one. So it'd have to be 20 people would get up and move. So it could certainly.
What if 10 of us left and started another firm and then went to the hospital and said, we'll undercut our former
them
if 10% or whatever?
Minimum efficient scale here is reasonably large. So you could think of it as being about 20 people or so. I mean, whether you think of this movement of the anesthesiologists as like from a firm going into a new market or just the 20 people leaving one market and going into the adjacent market, it's isomorphic. It wouldn't make a difference. Now, the reason why you couldn't in practice do that here in the example that I'm about to give is that you typically have long-term non-competes. Around 5 years or so, typically. And those would be enforceable, just to be clear, even in a state like California, where the non-compete is typically otherwise never enforceable. And that's because there's an equity piece given for it. So that would negate the good. The complaint reports that this sort of behavior may have occurred. In particular, in 2014, USAP allegedly paid MCare $9 million a year not to enter one of its markets. It's a bit more complicated than I'm going to let on here, but to quote one of the Welsh Carson employees, what USAP and Welsh Carson really wanted was an agreement for MCare not to compete with us in the Dallas-Fort Worth market. We'll simulate entry into each roll-up market by selecting the largest firm in any adjacent market that's not experiencing a roll-up, and we'll have them, in effect, donate clinicians from their market to the one that's been rolled up. We can vary the number of clinicians we move. If you focus attention all the way to the right, you could move a lot of clinicians into some of these big markets. That would, over these 18 markets, reduce expenditures on the order of about $40 million a year. But note, that makes the donor markets oftentimes much less competitive. And so you'll give up about 43% of the gains. As the rolled up market is becoming more competitive, about half of that is getting lost in the donor market. Big picture, there is a large literature in health policy, which is focusing on the impact of acquisitions by different types of providers, say for-profit or not-profit, physician-owned versus corporate-owned, even publicly traded companies relative to private equity. But this paper, I think, suggests that competitive considerations, ordinary, plain vanilla, horizontal logic swamps those concerns, at least in this industry. By extension, the techniques used by IO economists probably suffice to rationalize the large price changes that have been shown in that large literature in health policy. And by further extension, remedies available to antitrust law, at least in our view, suffice to correct them. We don't really need new tools or otherwise to address these types of transactions. Thank you.
Go ahead and take the question.
Fiona.
I got
tried to avoid liability and contested the transaction, and the judge ruled that USAP had to go into the trial, but Welsh Carson was off the hook because they had exited, they had sold half their stake. They went from 50% down to 23 or something.
Sure.
And only 2 directors. And so the judge said, they're not violating the antitrust laws anymore. So what that opens up is the idea that if the private equity company can exit fast enough, they're not on the hook anymore.
Sure.
And so whatever deterrent is devised, so in other words, the antitrust laws can't be used against Welsh Carson.
Okay.
So that we have to think about that problem.
Okay, good. So I've 2 things to add about that. One is now, at least when you talk to some counsel on the buy side, they'll say, one of the first questions you get here is, how did you come upon these assets? Because when Welsh Carson sold them to, I think it was Berkshire Partners is, colloquially speaking, left holding the bag now for potentially large losses as they paid $2 billion and it's only worth $1 billion after the extraction. So the due diligence will take care of, I think, some of this as it works itself out. Also, my understanding is, at least when it comes to the damages, where private plaintiffs bring this in a like a civil suit as a class action, I think Welsh Carson could still be on the hook there. I think some of that had to do with the FTC has this ruling going back to AMG a couple of years ago where they can't sue for damages. So, but you're certainly partially right there. Yeah.
I've got one. I hadn't seen you make the point about the potentially perfect complementarity between anesthesiology and surgery, and so there's like only the total price should matter. Actually, it seems plausible that those are perfect complements. I wouldn't want to get surgery without anesthesia.
Sure.
What is it? Just a pure externality that these anesthesiologists are putting on the hospitals or surgeons, that they're going to be under providing the optimal amount of the jointly profit maximizing number of surgery plus anesthesias now, or what do you think's going on there?
I don't know, for what it's worth. The arrangement tends to be at almost every hospital that the anesthesia writes a contract with the hospital, which more or less is just going to ensure 24-hour around the clock coverage. And
It's
nobody,
not surgery per surgery.
no, it's not, at least
Ah.
not to the best of my knowledge.
I see.
It's 24-hour agreed upon staffing for a certain number of rooms. They have emergency rooms, they have operating rooms, and then they've just got coverage over those.
I see.
Yeah. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, just building on that question, can you show a quantity effect? There's a price effect that you showed us?
For the most part, yeah.
The welfare implication would come from the quantity, not just.
Certainly. Otherwise, it's a transfer, although it would still be illegal under, the substance standards, Section 7. But yes, the quantity effect, at least from what we've measured, is pretty limited. I think in the long run, what's going to happen is that the price of the insurance goes up, or, for example, a lot of this gets passed through to my employer, currently University of Chicago, so they would pay that price, and the provision of healthcare, I think, has got to eventually decline. But the quantity effects that we see are pretty trivial at this point. I don't think that means that people are perfectly price inelastic. It's just that for whatever reason, we're not measuring them.
One question, if it's quick. Yes, John.
What about helicopter rescue? I guess private equity is going in there and they're charging outrageous prices for rescue.
That is absolutely right. They would be another one, which would be an even more egregious example of this. Extreme levels of consolidation, all done by sponsors. You're absolutely right. Good.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom.
Thank you.